Good evening, and welcome back. Tonight we are going to wander into one of those stories that everyone thinks they already know, but almost no one really does. This is the story of King Arthur and Camelot, a tale that has been told around fires, at long wooden tables, in quiet chapels, and now through headphones and glowing screens. You have probably heard pieces of it before, knights and queens and wizards and swords in stone, but tonight we are going to dive deep. Camelot is often painted as a perfect place, a shining city of music and banners and polished armor, where every knight is noble and every choice is clear. But under that bright surface there are questions that never quite go away. Was there a real Arthur behind the legend? Was there a real fortress or royal hall that people later turned into the idea of Camelot? How much of this story is history? How much is memory? And how much is the wild work of imagination that people carried from one generation to another? As always, I would love to know where in the world are you listening from. It is still shocking to know that I get comments from all around the world. Thank you for being here. Now, if you want, close your eyes and relax, and let us begin. Imagine Britain at the moment when the Roman world finally let go of it. For hundreds of years, soldiers from faraway provinces had marched on its roads and guarded its walls. Latin words had mixed with the local languages. Villas with tiled floors and warm baths dotted the countryside. Then, very slowly at first, and then all at once, that world began to crumble. Rome had its own fires to put out on the continent. Emperors changed faster than the seasons. Money ran thin. The long stone wall in the north, that once held back raiders, became more of a suggestion than a shield. That is the setting where any real Arthur, if he existed, would have walked. Not a shining king on a throne in a bright hall, but a war leader in a land that felt like the edge of the world. When we look for him in the actual written record, the silence is strange. There is a monk named Gildas who wrote a long, angry sermon about the sins of the Britons and the disasters that fell on them as punishment. He talks about a great battle at a place called Badon, where the Britons somehow stopped the advance of the Saxons. This was a turning point. For a moment, the tide of invasion broke and rolled back. Gildas praises the victory, but never gives the name of the general who led it. That gap is like a missing tooth that you cannot stop touching with your tongue. A few centuries later, another writer, probably a Welsh cleric, put together a work that later generations called The History of the Britons. Now, at last, a name appears. In a list of battles won against the Saxons, we meet a leader called Arthur. He is not called a king, he is called a war commander. The Latin phrase used for him translates roughly as leader of battles, a title more like general than crowned monarch. He leads the Britons to victory in 12 fights, and the last of them is at Badon. The writer even adds a flourish. At one battle, Arthur kills 940 men by himself in a single charge. That is the kind of detail that makes historians raise an eyebrow and storytellers smile. It tells you two things at once. First, that there may have been a strong memory of a successful champion around whom many stories clustered. Second, that those stories did not shy away from exaggeration. If you could stand in Britain at that time, somewhere between the late 5th century and the early 6th century, It would not look like the world of glittering Camelot yet. It would look rough and fractured. The old Roman towns still stood, but many were shrinking, their fine buildings abandoned or patched up with whatever timber was at hand. Out in the countryside, local chieftains, who might still wear Roman-style cloaks and wield Roman-style swords, were carving out their own small territories. On the eastern side of the island, new people were arriving in waves. They spoke Germanic languages and came from the regions that we now call Northern Germany and Denmark. Over time, we would call them Saxons and Angles and Jutes. To the native Britons, they were both hired muscle and dangerous invaders. Some kings hired them as mercenaries to fight their rivals. Others cursed them as destroyers who burned farms and holy sites. The truth was probably both at once. In that messy landscape, a strong leader who could unite different groups of Britons for even a short time would have been remembered as something special. This is where a figure like Arthur begins to make sense. Not necessarily a crowned king with a perfect sword and a court of flawless knights, but a tough commander who could rally warriors who spoke different dialects, who could ride from one hill fort to another, who knew the old Roman roads and the high hidden tracks across the moors. We do not know where he was born. We do not know what he looked like. Later, stories dress him in bright mail and give him a golden dragon banner. But in reality, his gear would have been much more practical. A well-made sword, a shield of wood and leather, maybe a coat of mail if he was important enough or lucky enough to have one. Perhaps a horse, though heavy cavalry in shining armor, the way later art shows them, belonged to a different age. What we do have, instead of clear biography, are scattered echoes. There are early Welsh poems that talk about warriors fighting beside a heroic figure whose name sometimes appears as Arthur and sometimes in older forms. There are place names in Wales and Cornwall and the north that claim he fought there, bled there, or threw stones there. Some of these are almost certainly later inventions. People love to attach grand stories to strange rocks and lonely hills, but the sheer number of these stories hints that for the Celtic-speaking people of Britain, Arthur was not just a character in a single story. He was part of a whole cloud of legend. Think of the way people in different towns tell stories about a famous band or a sports hero or a local outlaw. Some of the tales are true. Some are made larger than life every time they are told. Some migrate from one town to another. Something like that seems to have happened with Arthur. The church, with its monks and its scriptoria, played a huge part in shaping what survived. The people who could write in those centuries were almost all clerics. They had their own priorities. They cared about sin and salvation, about the fates of kings as examples of pride and punishment. They were also not above giving a little extra shine to the history of their own people. If you were a monk in Wales or Western Britain, surrounded by Saxon kingdoms that claimed to be the future, you might like the idea that once, long ago, your own people had a champion who held the invaders at bay. So when that Welsh cleric who wrote the history of the Britons reached back into stories and oral traditions, he may have pulled many threads into one figure. Maybe there was a commander named Arthur who fought at one real battle. Maybe there were several leaders who won important victories. Maybe there was even a famous Roman-style official whose name was similar. Over time, these separate men could have blended into the shape of a single, larger hero in the collective memory. You can imagine that process if you think about how we talk about ages of greatness. People say things like, the 60s were wild, or the Renaissance changed everything, even though those long stretches were made up of countless separate lives. For the Britons who survived the fall of Rome and the oncoming Saxon tide, the age of Arthur might have taken a similar shape in memory. A time when they fought back, a time when, for a while, they were not only victims of invasion but also victors in battle. The Battle of Badon, which Gildas mentions without naming a general, became the perfect anchor for this memory. Later writers could slide Arthur into that blank space in the story. The monk who wrote the history of the Britons lists that battle last as the crowning victory of Arthur's career. It is almost like watching someone set a jewel into an empty setting on a ring. The metal of the band was already there in Gildas. The stone is added later. By the time we reach the early medieval centuries that follow, the figure of Arthur has moved from a half-shadow in a terse Latin line to a proud warrior in Welsh heroic poetry. He is no longer just the name of a general, he is a measure of excellence. Other fighters are compared to him. Hunters swear by his name. Bards sing of feasts in his hall, even though they do not say exactly where that hall stood. Something important happens in that shift. It is the point where history, as best as the monks knew it, gives way to something more fluid. Once Arthur becomes a measure, a symbol of courage and victory, he can be placed wherever a poet wants to paint a scene of resistance. He can ride through misty forests that never existed in any chronicle. He can fight monsters as easily as Saxons. He can sit at a table where everyone is equal, even though real war councils were surely full of argument and ambition. The land itself begins to fill with stories tied to his name. People point to a ridge and say that is where Arthur and his men lie, sleeping under the hill until Britain needs them again. They point to a stone in a river and say he threw it there. They speak of lakes where a strange woman appears from the water holding a sword. Some of these tales are older Celtic myths that have nothing to do with a 5th century war leader, but once Arthur becomes the great hero, those older stories hitch a ride on his legend. From our distance, that layering can be frustrating if you are hunting for hard facts. Every time you think you have glimpsed a real person, another misty story wraps around him. But the layering is also what gives the legend its power. Arthur becomes the place where many different hopes meet. He is the strong man who keeps invaders at bay. He is the just ruler who listens to both nobles and common folk. He is the flawed husband who still tries to do the right thing. He is the king who may return when the land is in deep trouble. All of that starts here, in this twilight zone between Rome and the early medieval kingdoms, where people are trying to understand what happened to their world. Some look back and blame sin. Some look forward and talk about new peoples and new rulers. In that swirl of explanations, there is room for a story about one great protector. If you walked through a small settlement at that time, you might find people gathered in the dim light of a fire, eating rough bread and stew, while one person tells a tale of a battle that happened when their grandparents were children. The names of the places might be a little wrong. The numbers of the slain might swell with each telling. The enemy might change from Saxons to Picts, or even to otherworldly creatures. But the heart of the story would stay the same. There was a leader. He gathered men from many tribes. They stood in a line on a hill. They did not run. And for one day at least, the invaders broke upon them and fled. Whether we call that leader Arthur or something else, that is the seed of the myth. As years turn into centuries, that seed will grow into a great tree full of branches, full of strange fruits. Camelot will hang there like a golden apple. The sword in the stone will glitter there. The grail will be tucked away in its highest leaves. But the roots, the dark and tangled roots, are here in a land that has lost its empire, but not its memory of resistance. If the first shape of Arthur rose out of dark stories told in the ruins of the Roman world, the next great change happens not on a battlefield, but on parchment. It happens in quiet scriptoria and in the noisy halls of French and British courts, where people with ink-stained fingers and quick tongues discover that this old warrior king can be turned into something grander. For a long time, the story of Arthur lived mostly in Celtic memory. It was spoken in Welsh and in the old British tongue, in places where people still looked at the hills and saw the ghosts of lost battles. Then, in the 12th century, a cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth sits down to write a sweeping history of the kings of Britain. At least, that is what he calls it. To our eyes, it looks more like a great tide of legend, dressed up in the clothes of history. Geoffrey writes in Latin. His audience is made up of educated churchmen and nobles who can read or who can have the text read to them. He reaches back to the earlier traditions, pulls together stories of British kings, Roman emperors, and ancient prophecies, and gives Arthur a central place in that long tale. In Geoffrey's version, Arthur is no longer just a war leader. He is a conqueror who defeats Saxons, Scots, Irish, and even fights campaigns across the sea. His court shines with splendor. His life is woven with prophecies from the wizard Merlin. It is important to notice what Geoffrey does and does not do here. He gives Arthur a crown, a family, a string of victories that would make an emperor blush. He describes feasts and councils. He names places. But the court he talks about most often is not Camelot. It is Caerleon, a real Roman site in Wales that still had impressive ruins in Geoffrey's time. In the broken walls and weed-filled amphitheatre of Caerleon, people could already see the bones of an older grandeur. It made sense to place Arthur's radiant court there. Camelot, the name that would come to overshadow all others, enters the tale a little later and from a different direction. For that, we have to cross the sea in our imagination and sit for a while in the courts of the French-speaking nobles, who now rule much of England. After the Norman conquest, the language of power is no longer Old English. It is French. Poets in that language begin to do something new with old British stories. They are not writing sermons, they are writing romances. One of the most important of these poets is a man named Chrétien de Troyes. He lives and writes in the later 12th century, probably at the court of Marie of Champagne, a powerful patron who loves tales of love and adventure. Chrétien takes the Arthurian material and turns it into elegant verse that his audience can enjoy during long evenings in the hall. In his tales, Arthur becomes a kind of fixed star in the background. The focus shifts to individual knights whose adventures begin and end at his court. Eric rides out to prove himself and returns to be honored at Arthur's table. Yvain dreams of glory and love and strives to balance them. Lancelot, in perhaps the most famous of these poems, becomes the very model of passionate and conflicted knighthood. It is in one of these stories that a particular name appears on the page for the first time that we can see. The name is Camelot. Chrétien does not stop to explain it. He simply mentions it as the place where Arthur holds a great court, as if his audience already understands that this is a place of splendor. That small, casual touch tells us a lot. By the time the word is written down, the idea may already have been in the air. Listeners might have heard of a marvelous court called something like Camelot in oral tales that never got written earlier. What is striking is how little detail he gives about the location. He does not tell us what river Camelot stands by. He does not say if the sea can be seen from its walls. He is much more concerned with the nightly games, the tournaments, the banquets, the quiet glances between lovers in corners of the hall. For Chrétien, Camelot is a stage. It is the glittering backdrop against which his characters act out questions of honor, loyalty, and desire. Around the same time, another writer, Wace of Normandy, takes Geoffrey of Monmouth's grand Latin narrative and retells it in French verse. In doing so, he introduces something that will become one of the most famous images of Arthurian lore. Wace tells us that Arthur, tired of the petty quarrels over precedence among his nobles, has a table made that is round. At this table, no one sits above another. There is no throne side and low side. Every knight is equal in rank when he takes his place there. This is a brilliant piece of symbolic writing. It smooths away the jealous elbowing of real medieval politics and gives the court a clean moral shape. It says, here there is fairness. Here, at least in theory, the best man is not the one born highest, but the one who proves himself through courage and courtesy. Now imagine that round table placed in the center of Camelot, the unnamed shining city of Chrétien's romances. You can see the way different strands of story begin to knit. Geoffrey gives us the powerful king in a grand court. Wace gives the court its round table as a symbol. Chrétien and other French poets fill the hall with colorful characters. From Gawain and Lancelot to mysterious ladies whose favors are more desired than any piece of armor. None of these writers thinks they are inventing something that will one day be taken as a literal map. They are playing with stories in a way that feels natural in their time. If you ask where Camelot is, the answer is in the story itself. It is wherever the narrative needs a place of order and ceremony before the knights ride out into the wild places where giants, bandits, and enchantments wait. As more poets join this game, the world around Camelot grows. New tales bring in the Holy Grail, the mysterious cup associated with Christ and with spiritual quest. Knights ride not only for honor or love, but for visions of grace. Some are rewarded, some fail and fall. Arthur's court becomes both a political center and a spiritual gateway. It is the place where the best of human effort gathers and where the limits of that effort are exposed. While all this is happening in France and in French-speaking England, the stories do not vanish from the Celtic lands. Welsh storytellers keep their own versions of Arthur, where he can be a wilder figure, closer to the world of spirits and ancient gods. In some of those tales, he hunts supernatural boars. In others, he visits strange, otherworldly fortresses. When later scholars look at all these different versions side by side, they see that Camelot does not appear in the older Welsh material. It belongs to that 12th century flowering of courtly romance. That does not make it less powerful. It simply tells us that what we think of as the classic image of Arthur is the work of many hands and many evenings of listening. The scribes who copy these stories into manuscripts add their own touches. They paint initials with gold leaf and brilliant colors. They fill margins with miniature scenes of knights riding beside twisted vines and strange creatures. For someone in that world, opening a manuscript that contains Arthurian romances is like stepping into a painted doorway. You see the king, the table, the court. You see Camelot as a pattern of words and images. At this point, real geography starts to whisper from the edges. If you are a listener in Brittany or Anjou or London, you might begin to wonder where all of this takes place. You hear the names of forests and rivers that might be purely invented. You hear of Logres, the land ruled by Arthur, which sounds like an echo of the old Roman province of Britannia. Some poets mention familiar real places. Others create new names that sound half real. The result is a dreamlike map that hovers just above the real one. Later generations will try to pin that dream map down. They will say that Camelot must be here or there. They will walk the fields of Somerset or Cornwall or Wales and decide that this hill looks right, that this river bend feels like the place where knights might have ridden out at dawn. But for the people who first heard the name Camelot, it did not need to be pinned. It was enough that it lived in the shared imaginary space of the court, a place that could be summoned with a single word. What is interesting, if you listen closely to the tone of these early romances, is that there is always a hint of distance in the way they treat Arthur and his court. Arthur is often a little removed from the main action. He appears in scenes of ceremony, of judgment, of celebration. The wild things happen on the road and in the deep woods. The court is safe and shining, but the heart of the story often lies in the places that Camelot is not. That distance lets writers do something very subtle. They can keep Camelot perfect, or nearly so, while allowing the world outside to be full of danger and moral complexity. Then, in later tales, they can let cracks appear in the perfection. Lancelot's love for Guinevere, the queen, begins as courtly admiration and becomes a secret that threatens the whole order. Mordred, Arthur's kin, watches and waits for his chance to split the realm. The same court that once seemed unshakable becomes fragile. All of these later developments rest on the foundation laid in this 12th century burst of creativity. Without Chrétien dropping the name Camelot into his verse, without Wace and others giving us the round table and the polished etiquette of courtly life, there would be no golden city to shatter. Arthur might have remained only a war leader in a half-remembered list of battles. Instead, he becomes the center of a long cycle of stories that travel from language to language and land to land. Think for a moment about how this would feel for an ordinary listener in that time. You might be a minor knight, or even just a servant in the hall, sitting near the back while the poet recites. The world outside is hard. There are taxes and raids and illnesses that no one can explain. Then the poet opens his mouth, and suddenly you're in a bright hall where justice seems possible, where a king can be both strong and fair, where knights ride out not to strip peasants of their grain, but to fight monsters and free the innocent. Camelot, in that sense, is not just a place in a story. It is a wish. It is an image of how power might look if it were truly noble. That does not mean that people believed such a place literally existed exactly as described. It means that they felt the need for a vision like that and found it in these tales. Over time, as manuscripts are copied and carried, as storytellers move from one court to another, that wish spreads. Versions of the Arthurian cycle reach Germany, where writers like Wolfram von Eschenbach remake the Grail story. They reach Scandinavia, where sagas adapt them into their own narrative traditions. With every retelling, Camelot is slightly rebuilt. New details appear. Old ones are dropped. Yet the core idea remains. There is a center of the world, a great hall of justice and fellowship, and its name is Camelot. So by the time we look back from our own age and ask where Camelot truly was, we are not just asking about stones and earth. We are asking about centuries of layered dreams. The earliest brick in that shining city is literary. It is the quiet scratch of a quill in the hand of a poet who writes a single line that says something like, "The king held court in Camelot." From that line, countless towers rise. When people picture Camelot, they rarely imagine tax disputes or wet boots at the door or the smell of horses. They see a wide hall of smooth stone, banners with curling beasts fluttering under a timber roof, a ring of polished chairs, and in the middle of it all, a perfect circle of wood, the round table. In imagination, it is always clean, always sunlit, always full of noble faces that never seem to grow tired or bored. Inside the stories, though, once you step closer, that circle is full of living people. That is really what this part of the legend is about. Arthur might be the sun at the center, but around him move the hard, bright planets of his knights, each with his own path, his own flaws, and his own secret hopes. The idea of chivalry that rules them is both simple and impossible. A knight is meant to be brave in battle and gentle in peace, fierce to enemies and kind to the weak, loyal to his king but also obedient to his God, ready to bleed for honor and yet humble at heart. If you try to hold all of that in your mind at once, you can feel how much strain it puts on a real human being. That strain fills the hole with stories. Imagine arriving at Camelot as a young knight who has never seen anything bigger than a local lord's hall. The road has been long. Your cloak is stained with dust. You pass through outer gates and catch your first glimpse of the inner courtyard. There are grooms leading horses, with saddles that shine with silver. There are squires wrestling in the straw. There is a glimpse of the hall door standing open, and inside you see light from torches and hear the low murmur of many voices. You are brought before Arthur. Later traditions show him as a man with calm eyes and a sword named Excalibur at his side. In some tales, the sword came from a stone. In others, it was gifted by a mysterious lady of a lake. Whatever its origin, it is a sign that this man is set apart. You kneel. You swear to defend the helpless, to tell the truth, to fight for justice, to be loyal to this king even when it costs you dearly. The blade taps each shoulder. When you stand, you are not simply a warrior any longer. You have joined something larger than yourself. That larger thing is wrapped up in the round table. In earlier courts, and in real medieval halls, the high table at the far end was where the most important sat. Everyone else arranged themselves down the length, and you could tell your worth by how far you were from the head. At Arthur's court, the poets tell us that he solved this by having a round table made, so that no one could claim to sit above another. It is a beautiful image, especially when you remember how much pride and rivalry stirred in the noble world. Of course, Even in the stories, pride does not simply go away because a carpenter made a circle. The Round Table is a promise that the best man can prove himself through deeds rather than birth. But there are still arguments, still competitions, still harsh words flung in anger. The difference is that when those tempers flare, the ideal of the Round Table stands in the background like a mirror. Everyone knows what they are supposed to live up to, and that knowledge can sting. The knights who gather there are more than names on a list. Take Gawain, for instance. In many early tales, he is the measure of courtesy and strength. He can fight from morning until noon and still be polite at dinner. He is the one who steps forward when a strange challenger asks for a volunteer, as in the story of the Green Knight. There, Gawain agrees to a terrifying bargain and then spends a year wrestling with his own fear and his own sense of honor. It is not just a monster story. It is a careful study of a man who wants very much to live up to the code he has sworn. Then there is Lancelot. He enters the legend later but quickly becomes its most vivid knight. The French poets make him the best fighter in the world and also the most devoted lover. His loyalty to Arthur is absolute in public. His love for Guinevere, the queen, burns in secret and tears him apart. In one scene, he is willing to cross a sword-sharp bridge that cuts his flesh to reach her. In another, he hesitates at a test of purity and fails to see a sacred vision because his heart is divided. Lancelot sits at the Round Table like everyone else, but in his chest, two vows battle. One is to the king who trusted him. The other is to the woman he cannot stop loving. The code of chivalry tells him he must be faithful to both. Yet the situation he lives in makes that impossible. That tension is what gives his story its piercing sadness. It also hints at something about Camelot itself. Even in the most perfect court, the human heart has corners that do not fit neatly into any rule. On the other side of the spectrum stands Galahad, the pure knight who appears mostly in the stories of the Holy Grail. He is sometimes described as the son of Lancelot and a woman who deceived him, which already tells you that his birth is tangled up in failure and regret. Yet Galahad himself grows into a figure of such spiritual clarity that ordinary life cannot hold him. He is the one who achieves the Grail, who sees what others cannot, and then passes beyond the world. At the Round Table, he seems almost less a person than a bright flame. Something dropped into the story to show what would happen if someone truly lived up to the strictest meaning of the chivalric code and the Christian ideal at the same time. The cost is that he does not stay long. In some versions, he does not return to Camelot at all. The king and the court have to go on without him, dealing with their more ordinary mix of duty and desire. Between those poles, you find dozens of other figures. There is Percival, the simple youth whose innocent mistakes almost ruin the Grail quest, and whose slow learning becomes a kind of lesson in itself. There is Tristan, whose love for Isolde comes from a potion and then runs wild, echoing and darkening the theme of forbidden love that Lancelot and Guinevere live out. There are quieter knights too, whose names fill out the seats, but whose stories are only hinted at, like the background figures in a painted scene. Chivalry does not only show itself in high quests. You can feel it in the everyday rhythms of the court. There are tournaments where knights ride out in display, blunted lances in hand, to show their skill before ladies and lords who watch from framed stands. The color and noise of these games are part training, part spectacle. Underneath the banners and music, however, there is always the shadow of real war. Many of these men have stood in real blood, not just in mock contests. The code that tells them to be generous and gracious at table also tells them to break enemies on the field. In the stories, this double life is often visible. A knight might ride out to deal with a bandit lord who terrorizes a region. The fight is ugly, grim work. When he returns, he kneels before Arthur and speaks with careful, formal words. A lady might ask for justice, and the knight will pledge himself to her cause with a seriousness that borders on religious. The hall thus becomes a place where raw violence is dressed in ritual to make it feel bearable and meaningful. Religious faith underlines all of this. Most of the great Arthurian tales take place in a world where church bells and holy days are part of the fabric of life. Knights hear mass before they ride out. The Grail, when it appears in the later traditions, is tied to the Last Supper and to mysterious currents of grace. When the Grail quest is announced in the hall, it is not just another adventure. It is a call that divides the company. Some go and are never seen again. Some return broken, having seen too much. Some stay, knowing in their hearts that they are not ready for that level of purity. For Arthur, the Grail is both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, it confirms that his court is so renowned that heaven itself pays attention to it. On the other, it draws away some of his best men and exposes the moral cracks in the ones who remain. Lancelot, striving to see the Grail, faints at the threshold. Gawain, full of courage, finds that courage alone is not enough. Only Galahad, with his clear gaze, can fully behold it and live. When that vision is over, a sense of emptiness hangs over Camelot, as if something beyond human measure has passed by and left them measured and found wanting. While all these grand quests swirl around the Round Table, life in the city of Camelot carries on. In the imagination of later poets and artists, its streets are full of merchants, craftsmen, and ordinary folk who benefit from the peace that Arthur and his knights supposedly keep. You can imagine children playing at nights in an alley, wrapping rags around their arms as pretend armor, swinging sticks at invisible foes, and then marching home when the church bell rings for evening prayer. In that sense, Camelot is not just a playground for nobles. It is the center of a kingdom where rules matter. The code of chivalry, for all its lofty language, has practical edges. It says, in effect, that the strong must protect the weak, that promises should be kept, that hospitality is sacred. Real medieval courts did not always live up to that, of course, but the stories insist that Arthur's court at least tries. That insistence shapes the way listeners think about power. They begin to judge their own rulers by comparison, even if only in private thoughts. Yet the same chivalric code that tries to restrain violence also makes it glamorous. The songs celebrate courage, and courage is proven most clearly in battle. Young men who hear these tales may dream of standing in bright armor before a cheering hall, sword upraised. The writers of the romances understood this. They give us scenes of glory, but they often sneak in scenes of regret as well. Wives watching from walls as husbands ride out, fields trampled under hooves, brothers who do not return. The Round Table is magnificent, but it sits in a world where even the best intentions can lead to grief. This, more than anything, keeps the stories from feeling like simple fairy tales. They know that people can fail. They show us knights who break their vows and then wrestle with guilt, who confess, who try again. They show us a king who sometimes makes mistakes and cannot see all the consequences of his decisions. If you think of Camelot at its height, perhaps at some great feast after a victory, it is easy to feel the pull of that brightness. Music fills the hall. A storyteller is recounting an older tale of Arthur's early battles. Cups are passed. The king looks content. Around the circle of the round table, faces glow in the firelight. Some are young and hungry for fame. Some are older, their eyes lined with memory. At that moment, the code of chivalry feels attainable. People laugh. Promises are toasted. But seeds of trouble are already in the room. Somewhere at that table sits a man who secretly resents the favor shown to Lancelot. Somewhere stands a knight who has pledged his love to a lady who cannot return it without dishonor. Somewhere in the city, a commoner who loved the ideals of the court has been wronged by a noble and denied real justice. The very intensity of the ideal makes any failure to reach it feel like a crack in the world. It is no accident that later storytellers will place the beginning of the fall of Camelot not in a defeat on the field, but in moments where the code is bent or broken, when friendship and loyalty are set against private desire, when sworn brothers fight each other, the round table itself seems to tremble. What was once a symbol of unity begins to look brittle. For now, though, in this part of the legend, we can pause in that bright hall and look around. We can see how the poets and chroniclers filled the seats with vivid characters, how they took a vague war leader and his court and turned them into a whole universe of stories about honor, love, faith, and failure. We can feel why listeners for centuries kept returning to this image of a ring of knights in a city that promised a better kind of rule. It was not simply pretty decoration. It was a way of thinking through some of the hardest questions about what it means to be strong and good at the same time. The stories always make Camelot shine brightest just before it begins to fall apart. For a long stretch of the tale, Arthur's court feels solid. The round table is full, the banners are fresh, the songs are loud. Then, slowly at first and then very quickly, small cracks become deep fractures. When you look closely at how the fall is told, you see that it is not one single blow that destroys Camelot. It is a chain of betrayals, loves, grudges, and bad choices, all wrapped around one last bloody battle and one quiet journey to a place called Avalon. At the center of this unraveling sit three figures who were once at the heart of the glory. Arthur himself, the king who tried to rule with justice; Guinevere, the queen who gives the court its grace; Lancelot, the greatest knight, the man whose name had become almost a spell for courage. The tragedy of Camelot is that the very people who helped make the court so extraordinary are also those whose tangled lives helped destroy it. Different versions of the story tell it in different ways, but the broad shape remains. Lancelot and Guinevere fall into a love that goes beyond admiration and courtly flirtation. At first, it is something that lives in glances and careful words, and the way he kneels before her chair. Then, as the poets tell it, it becomes a secret that cannot bear the light of the great hall. They meet privately. They speak words they cannot say where others can hear. You can imagine what that feels like inside a place that has built itself on the idea of open honor and clear vows. The Code of Camelot says that loyalty to the king is absolute. It also says that a knight must serve his lady with devoted heart. Lancelot is trying to follow both of these rules at once and finds that, in his life, they are in direct conflict. The strain shows in small ways at first. He leaves the hall abruptly when certain songs are sung. He grows quiet when others praise Guinevere in jest. The court is not blind. There are always eyes at the edges of any bright gathering. Some of the knights genuinely admire Lancelot and would never raise a word against him. Others have grudges. Maybe he defeated them in a tournament. Maybe they lost a chance at glory because he was the one chosen for a quest. Among those who watch him closely stands Mordred. Mordred is one of the strangest figures in the Arthurian legend. In some traditions, he is Arthur's nephew, the son of his sister Morgause and her husband Lot of Orkney. In others, he is the result of a darker and more confused encounter, a child conceived when Arthur sleeps with a woman he does not realize is his half-sister. Either way, there is a sense that Mordred carries the stain of a twisted family line. He grows up in the shadow of Arthur's greatness, keenly aware that he is of the royal blood, but not at the center of the circle. You can picture him as a man who smiles at the right moments, who kneels when he should, who says the correct formal words, and yet behind his eyes there is always a kind of calculation. He sees what others miss. He notices that Guinevere's gaze lingers a little too long on Lancelot when the hall laughs. He notices that Lancelot seems to know where the queen is, even when she is not seated at her place beside Arthur. In some of the French prose cycles, it is Mordred and his brother Agravain who finally decide to expose the affair. They come to Arthur not with wild rumors, but with specific accusations. They say that if the king will permit it, they will prove that Lancelot visits the queen in secret. Arthur hesitates. This is not an accusation against a minor knight. This is a blow aimed at his closest friend and his wife in one stroke. If he does nothing, he betrays his own laws. If he believes them, he risks tearing his court apart. The king chooses to test the claim. A trap is set. The story tells that Guinevere and Lancelot are together in her chamber when the hall outside suddenly fills with noise. Knights who have been waiting storm the doorway. Lancelot fights like a cornered lion. He kills several of those who try to seize him, some of whom were also members of the Round Table. Guinevere is taken into custody, accused of treason through adultery, and condemned to be burned. Lancelot escapes into the night. At this point, the fall of Camelot could still be stopped. Arthur is wounded in his pride and in his love, but he might have chosen mercy or quiet banishment. Instead, events rush forward. The burning of Guinevere is arranged as a public act. She is led to the stake, and the gathered crowd stares in shock. Then, at the last moment, Lancelot arrives with armed men, cuts her free, and carries her away. In the chaos, he kills more of his former comrades, including in some versions Gareth and Gaheris, who were beloved by Arthur and by Gawain. The house is truly divided now. Lancelot retreats to his own lands, often placed over the sea in France. Arthur pursues him with an army. Those who ride with the king feel that they are upholding justice and punishing a traitor. Those who ride with Lancelot believe they are defending a wronged friend and his lady from a sentence that was too harsh. No one seems able to step back and say, if we keep going, there will be nothing left of what we once were. Arthur makes one decision in this moment that will echo to the end. As he prepares to cross the sea to besiege Lancelot's stronghold, he leaves Mordred in charge of the kingdom. It looks like a practical choice. Mordred is of royal blood. Someone must sit the throne while the king is away. Perhaps Arthur tells himself that giving Mordred this trust will bind him more tightly to the crown. Instead, it gives Mordred the opportunity he has been waiting for. Once Arthur's fleet has gone, Mordred calls councils. He whispers to the nobles who remain. He tells them that Arthur will never return, or that if he does, he will bring more war and more exhaustion. He says that Britain has bled enough for the quarrels of a king and his favorite knight. Slowly, he wins support. Some of the men he convinces may honestly believe that they are choosing stability. Others may simply see a chance to improve their own position. In the most dramatic versions of the story, Mordred goes further. He spreads the rumor that Arthur has died in the foreign war. He has himself crowned. He tries to force Guinevere to marry him, to cement his claim. The Queen, now back in Britain, flees from him and takes refuge in a convent. The situation turns surreal. Arthur is alive, fighting Lancelot abroad, while at home someone with his blood sits on his throne and tries to take his queen. News travels back to Arthur at last. He sets aside the war with Lancelot. In some versions, Lancelot even offers aid against Mordred. But Arthur refuses, or events move too quickly for such an alliance to form. The king turns his army back toward Britain and sails home, not to rebuild Camelot, but to face his own kin in a last struggle. The final battle goes by the name Camlan in the older sources. No one knows exactly where that was meant to be. Over the centuries, people have pointed at hills and river valleys and said, "Here, this is the place." Some have suggested a site in Cornwall. Others favor locations in the west of England. The uncertainty has become part of the story's atmosphere. Camlan is less a precise spot on a map than the idea of the last field where everything finally breaks. The mood of the tale as the armies gather is heavy. This is not a bright tournament. This is a family war. On one side stands Arthur, older now, carrying the weight of many choices. On the other stands Mordred, who has grown from cold observer to open usurper. Between them stretch ranks of men who once might have drunk together under the same roof. Some versions of the legend speak of an attempt at a truce. Arthur and Mordred meet between their lines with only a few attendants each. The terms are harsh, but not impossible, they argue. They circle around the question of how much power Mordred will give back. Finally, they agree that a peace will be declared if, during their meeting, no sword is drawn. Then something small happens. One of the soldiers at the back sees a snake crawl out of the grass and strike at his foot. He reacts by drawing his blade to kill it. The flash of steel catches the light. Nervous men on the other side see the glint and think that someone has betrayed the truce. They shout. They raise weapons. Within moments, the slow tension bursts into open violence. It is an awful image, not only because of the blood that follows, but because of the way it suggests that even the best laid plans for peace can be undone by fear and misunderstanding. Swords ring, spears break, the field fills with bodies. The poets say that by the end of the day, nearly every knight of the Round Table who remains is dead. When the dust settles, Mordred is dead on the field. Arthur is not yet gone, but his wound is mortal. He is carried away from the noise of the battle to a small chapel or a quiet field, depending on the telling. The once great king who led armies across Britain now lies on a simple bed or on the earth, wondering what is left of his realm. It is at this low point that one of the most haunting episodes unfolds. Arthur looks at the sword that has been with him through so many victories. He knows that it should not fall into the wrong hands. He calls a loyal knight, often named Bedivere, and orders him to take the sword to a nearby lake and throw it into the water. Bedivere takes the weapon, walks some distance, and stops. You can see his problem. The sword is beautiful. Its hilt is worked with jewels. It is a symbol of everything that Arthur's kingship meant. To throw it away feels like an insult to the king and to the memory of the court. So Bedivere hides the sword among rushes or in a tree and returns, claiming that he has done as he was told. Arthur asks what he saw. Bedivere says that nothing happened. The sword simply sank. Arthur does not believe him. He sends him again. The same struggle plays out. Again, Bedivere cannot quite bring himself to let the sword go. Again, he lies. Finally, Arthur's anger and sorrow cut through his hesitation. On the third attempt, Bedivere grips the sword, walks to the water's edge, and hurls it out over the dark surface. The lake does not simply swallow the blade. A hand clad in shining fabric rises from the water, catches the sword by its hilt, and brandishes it 3 times before sinking beneath the surface. When Bedivere returns and tells Arthur what he has seen, the king knows that the sword has gone back to the other world that gave it. Something has closed. Soon after this, a boat appears on the lake. It carries women in hoods, often called queens, sometimes associated with figures like Morgan Le Fay. They come not as enemies, but as mourners and helpers. They take Arthur into the boat and carry him away toward a place the stories call Avalon. The wounded king is born out of the mortal world, while his last faithful knight watches from the shore. Avalon has its own layers of meaning. In some descriptions, it is the Isle of Apples, a place of healing and unaging peace. In others, it is simply an island over the water where Arthur's wound can be tended. The idea that he does not quite die, but instead goes to rest in this hidden land, feeds the later belief that he will one day return when his people need him. He becomes not just a dead king, but the once and future king, sleeping somewhere just beyond the edge of sight. Centuries later, that image of Avalon drifting at the edge of the world will meet a very real place in Western England. There, in a marshy landscape that was once full of water and reed beds, a hill rises with the ruins of a great abbey beside it. The hill is called Glastonbury Tor. The abbey that grew at its feet became one of the richest in the land. To people in the early Middle Ages, the area around Glastonbury could look like an island surrounded by water during floods. Old Celtic tradition speaks of it as an Isle of Glass, a place already half in the realm of story. In the year when a great fire tears through the abbey, destroying buildings and treasures, the monks who live there face a desperate need to rebuild. They require money and pilgrims. At the same time, rulers on the throne in England have their own reasons to be interested in the Arthur legend. Welsh rebels still sometimes speak of Arthur as a hope, a king who will rise again to drive out foreign dominations. A dead, heroic king is less dangerous to those in power than a king who might someday return. So, around the end of the 12th century, the monks of Glastonbury announce a remarkable discovery. They claim that while digging in the cemetery between two ancient stone markers, they found a large grave. In that grave, they report, there was a hollowed-out log used as a coffin. Inside lay the bones of a very tall man, and beside them, the remains of a smaller woman. With them was a leaden cross, inscribed with words that identified the burial as that of Arthur and his queen, placed in the Isle of Avalon. The details differ from account to account, but the core is the same. The monks say that they have not only found Arthur's grave, they have also proved that Avalon is Glastonbury. Kings and nobles are told of the find. Visitors come to see the bones. The remains are later moved into a more splendid tomb within the church, where they can be viewed by pilgrims who leave offerings. You can hear in this story the echo of many motives. The abbey gains a powerful new attraction, a reason for the faithful to travel there and support its rebuilding. The rulers of the land gain a narrative that says, in effect, Arthur is truly dead and buried. There will be no return to disturb the current order. At the same time, ordinary people who have loved the legend for generations now have a place they can point to and say, that is where the great king rests. From a modern point of view, it is easy to be suspicious of the discovery. The timing is convenient. The monks had every reason to produce something spectacular. No one in that age had the means to test the bones in the way scientists might today. Yet the find was widely accepted by many at the time, and it left a deep mark on the way people imagined Avalon. Instead of a misty otherworld, Avalon could be reached by walking across soggy English fields to a real mound of earth and stone. Even if you set aside the question of whether those bones had anything to do with a historic figure behind Arthur, the way Glastonbury embraced the role of Avalon tells you something important about how legend and landscape interact. Monks took an existing story about a hidden island of healing and victory and tied it to their own hill and their own church. The land itself became a part of the narrative thread. So the fall of Camelot ends in two places at once. In the stories, it ends on the field of Camlan, where Arthur and Mordred tear each other down and the Round Table dies in blood. It ends again on a quiet shore, with a barge slipping away toward an unseen island. In the world of stone and soil, it ends in a grave at Glastonbury that may or may not have belonged to anyone named Arthur, but that certainly belongs to the long history of how people have hunted for a real Camelot and a real king beneath their feet. Centuries pass after that last boat slips toward Avalon, but Arthur does not leave the stage. Camelot falls, the Round Table breaks. Yet somehow the story keeps walking from fire to fire, from language to language. Every age that inherits it reshapes it a little, like a craftsman taking an old piece of gold and hammering it into a new ornament. When you follow that trail, you can see how people were not only telling a good story, they were also hunting for a real Arthur and a real Camelot in their own time, in their own countryside, and even in their own politics. After the age of the first Latin chroniclers and the flowering of French romances, the tale moves into a new form. In England, sometime in the 15th century, a man named Thomas Malory sits in prison and decides to gather the wandering stories into one long narrative. We do not know exactly what he did to end up in a cell. The records accuse him of violence and theft. The man who creates the most famous version of the chivalric code may not have been a model knight in his real life. From his confinement, Malory reaches out with his mind into the shelves of earlier tales. He pulls in French romances, English poems, and bits of older chronicles. He arranges them into a single sweeping story of Arthur, from his magical conception to his last ride to Avalon. Along the way, he adds his own touches. He gives more weight to some episodes, smooths others, and balances the love triangle of Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot with battles and quests. Malory writes in English, not Latin, and not French. That choice matters. It fixes the legend in the language that will become dominant in England. When William Caxton prints Malory's work at the end of the 15th century, the story that had once moved in the air of court and cloister now exists in a form that can be carried, owned, and reread. It is as if Camelot has been pinned to the page with iron type. Even in Malory's long tale, Camelot itself is still oddly slippery. The court appears, the Round Table is described, Arthur holds his feasts, but the exact place on the real map remains uncertain. Malory mentions various towns that might be linked to the Great Hall. He draws on an older association between Arthur and Caerleon on Usk, that Roman site whose ruined amphitheatre and baths had long impressed visitors. He also gives a role to Winchester, where a massive round table hangs on the wall of the Great Hall, painted with the names of knights. That physical table is a curious object in this story. It is a real piece of timber, more than 5 meters across, built sometime in the later Middle Ages. No one carved it in Arthur's time. It has stood in the hall at Winchester for centuries, changing its paint and decoration as rulers remake its meaning. Yet because it is solid and old and round, people point to it and say, there is the Round Table. It is not a ruin on a hill, but it is another way the legend pushes into actual space. By the time the Tudors come to power, the story of Arthur has moved from simple entertainment into the realm of political usefulness. The new dynasty, which comes to the throne after a brutal civil conflict, is eager to claim deep roots in the history of Britain. Genealogists and chroniclers are encouraged to find lines of descent that link Tudor blood back to the great kings of the past. Arthur sits tall among those figures. Henry VII names his first son Arthur. He chooses to have that boy born at Winchester, and the old Round Table on the wall there is repainted with bright colors and a Tudor rose, as if to say that the ancient chivalric world and the new ruling house are part of the same story. Of course, the real Prince Arthur dies young, and it is his younger brother Henry who becomes king as Henry VIII. But the message remains. Arthur is claimed as a forerunner and a kind of patron spirit of English rule. At the same time, the idea of Camelot as a lost golden court still appeals to the imagination of ordinary people and to wandering writers. In Wales and Cornwall, scholars collect old Welsh triads and poems where Arthur appears in more rugged form. On the continent, versions of the Grail stories and knightly adventures continue to be copied. The hunt for Camelot in this period is not yet about scientific digging. It is more about claiming moral and symbolic inheritance. Kings say, Arthur was ours. Towns say, Arthur ruled here. It is only later, when people begin to think of the past in a more archaeological way, that the search for a physical Camelot really begins to heat up. The Romantic movement of the 19th century plays a huge role in this change. After the hard lines of the Age of Reason, writers and artists turn again toward mystery, emotion, and medieval images. Ruined abbeys, misty forests, and tales of tragic knights become fashionable. In Britain, one of the most powerful voices in that wave is Alfred Lord Tennyson. His idols of the king take the old Arthurian stories and retell them in long, lush poems that Victorians read by lamplight. Tennyson's Arthur is not quite the rough war leader of the early sources. He is a moral figure, an almost holy king struggling to maintain a pure court in a world full of temptation and decay. Tennyson's Camelot is painted with rich detail. You can see the towers and the river, the women leaning from balconies, the reflecting shields of knights as they ride out. One of his most famous pieces, The Lady of Shalott, places a lonely woman in a tower near Camelot, cursed to watch the world only through a mirror. When she looks directly at Lancelot, her life unravels, and she floats down the river toward the city in a boat, her name written on the prow. That image of the dead woman drifting toward the towers of Camelot while people stand on the quay and wonder who she is, becomes one of the most enduring pictures of the city in art. Painters pick up that vision and add their own. The group known as the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, fascinated by medieval legend and symbolic beauty, paints Arthurian scenes with intense color and detail. Their Guinevere is proud and sorrowful, their Lancelot haunted, their Gawain contemplative. In the background of these canvases, Camelot appears as arches, courtyards, glimpses of stone walls beside water. None of these artists has seen a real Camelot, yet by painting it over and over, they fix a certain look in the public mind. While poets and painters are filling the air with images, another kind of explorer is moving quietly through fields and along old roads. Antiquarians, the early cousins of archaeologists, take notes on old stones, earthworks, and ruins that scatter the British landscape. They read medieval chronicles and try to match the place names in those texts with the hills and rivers they see. They know that Geoffrey of Monmouth placed Arthur's court at Caerleon, so they travel to that town in Wales and stand inside the broken oval of the Roman amphitheatre, imagining it filled with knights and courtiers. They know that Geoffrey also said Arthur was conceived at Tintagel, a dramatic headland in Cornwall, so they climb the windswept path to the ruins of a later castle there and listen to the sea crash below. They hear local guides tell them that this was the very place where the great king was born, even though the stones under their feet belong to a different century. In Somerset, another place begins to stir interest. On a flat plain broken by low heights, a steep hill rises with deep, ancient ditches circling it. The locals call it South Cadbury. On its summit, half hidden by grass and trees, lie the remains of massive earthworks. In the 16th century, a royal antiquary named John Leland visits the site and writes down what he hears from the villagers. They say that the hill is called Camelot, that it was once a famous castle, and that it belonged to Arthur. Leland does not have our tools or our methods, but he has a sharp eye and a curiosity that will set a pattern for later scholars. His note is the first written record that links this particular hill to the name Camelot. It does not prove anything by itself. People can give grand names to old mounds for many reasons, yet that little line in his report will lie there like a seed in the soil for hundreds of years. As the centuries turn, interest in Arthur and Camelot moves up and down like a tide. There are periods when the legend is central, used in poems, plays, and political speeches. There are periods when it feels old-fashioned, pushed aside by new concerns. But it never vanishes. There is always someone somewhere drawing another map that places Camelot here or there, writing another essay that argues for one hill over another, painting another picture of shining towers. By the 20th century, archaeology has become a more careful craft. Excavations are planned, recorded, and analyzed with methods that would have surprised the old antiquarians. When someone digs into a hill now, they keep track of each layer of soil, each shard of pottery, each bone. They use these fragments to build a picture of how a site grew and changed over time. It is in this context that the old story about Cadbury and Camelot wakes up. Scholars reread John Leland's note that speaks of Camelot and Arthur's castle. They look at the great ring of earthworks around the hill and wonder if there might be something under the turf that speaks of the right time period. Local lore still calls it Arthur's Palace. In the 1960s, archaeologist Leslie Alcock leads a series of excavations at South Cadbury. The work goes on for several seasons. Trenches cut through the ramparts, post holes, pottery fragments, and bits of metal emerge from the ground. The team finds evidence that the hill was an important place across many centuries. The earliest traces point to the Iron Age. There are layers from the Roman period, when the empire still reached across the Channel. Most exciting for those who dream of Arthur, there are also signs of major rebuilding in the 5th and 6th centuries, the same general period when the battles of a historical Arthur would have taken place if he existed. The ramparts are strengthened and faced with stone. Inside the defenses, the dig reveals the outline of a large timber hall, big enough to serve as a lord's gathering place. The amount of imported pottery suggests a high-status community, one that had trade links across the sea. Imagine standing there in the summer sun, looking at the chalk lines that mark where posts once stood. It is not hard to picture a long building with a thatched roof, firelight flickering through its smoke hole, men and women sitting on benches while a harp plays. From the crest of the hill, you can see the Somerset levels stretched out below, once far more watery than they are now, and on a clear day you can pick out Glastonbury Tor on the horizon. The press at the time cannot resist the story. Reports speak of Camelot found at last. Photographs show trenches with labels and men in muddy boots holding bits of ancient pottery. Some archaeologists, including the famous Mortimer Wheeler, express cautious excitement. A committee is formed to support the study of the site, and it proudly bears the name Camelot Research Committee. Among the professionals, there is always a careful line. The most honest thing to say is that South Cadbury was clearly an important stronghold in the right period, one that matches the general picture of what a high-status British hill fort might have looked like when the Saxons were advancing. That makes it a plausible candidate for the kind of place a historical Arthur might have held. It does not prove that Arthur lived there. It does not carve the word Camelot into the rock. Still, for the wider public, the appeal is powerful. Visitors go to the hill, walk up the path through the trees, and stand in the wind on the summit, imagining the clatter of hooves and the murmur of the great hall. Guidebooks begin to include the name Camelot beside South Cadbury. The old story that Leland wrote down, the one about locals calling the place Arthur's, feels strangely confirmed by the trenches and the finds. Legend and science have not exactly shaken hands, but they are at least walking beside each other for a while. Other places also stake their claim. In Caerleon, the Roman ruins continue to be marketed as a possible Camelot, with visitors told that the amphitheatre might have been the setting for Arthur's assemblies. In Cornwall, Tintagel becomes a magnet for those who want to stand where Geoffrey of Monmouth said Arthur was conceived. Excavations on that headland uncover high-status buildings and imported pottery from the late Roman and early medieval periods, again suggesting that important people once lived and traded there. The castle ruins that sit on the site are later than any possible Arthur, but the layers of time blur for tourists who stand on the bridge and look out to sea. At Glastonbury, the abbey ruins still draw pilgrims of a different sort. Some are spiritual seekers drawn by modern myths about energy lines and holy wells. Some are history lovers who know about the monks' claim to have found Arthur's grave. For them, walking among the broken arches and grass-covered graves is a way to touch the long echo of that announcement. They may not believe that the bones the monks displayed were truly those of Arthur. Yet they feel that in this place, more than in many others, the line between story and stone grew thin. In all of these hunts and identifications, you can see a pattern. Camelot is not one fixed point. It is a question that each generation answers according to its own needs and dreams. For the Tudor kings, Camelot was a noble court whose glory could reflect on their own. For the Victorians, it was a stage on which to act out dramas of purity, temptation, and moral fall. For 20th century archaeologists, it became a puzzle to be solved with trowels and sieves and careful notes. Behind all of this, the figure of Arthur himself hovers, sometimes as a real warlord, sometimes as a moral symbol, sometimes as a marketing tool. The hunt for Camelot is the hunt for the moment where all three of those roles might overlap. A real hill fort that matches the right period and geography. A set of stories that has invested that region with meaning. A modern society that wants a link to a heroic but complicated past. As you watch this long dance between legend and landscape, it becomes clear that even if some new discovery tomorrow produced an inscription saying, "Arthur ruled here," the myth would not settle down. It would simply add one more layer to the tale. The search itself has become part of the story. People are no longer only telling what happened long ago. They are also telling how monks dug up bones, how poets wrote verses, how archaeologists opened trenches, how tourists took pictures at sunset. The Camelot you carry in your mind probably owes something to all of these stages. It has a little of Mallory's rich English, a little of Tennyson's River and Towers, A little of a Cadbury Hills silhouette against a grey sky, a little of the old abbey at Glastonbury half submerged in earth. It is both a real place and an imagined city that floats slightly above the ground, just out of reach. In the stories, Camelot faded into the mist long ago. The last thing we see is a wounded king carried away toward an island that might be real or might be somewhere just beyond the edge of waking. Then the tales move on, and for a long time it feels as if the city belongs only to dreams and old parchment. Yet, if you stand in our time and look around, you will see that the hunt for Camelot never really stopped. It simply changed shape. The knights now carry trowels and laptops. The wizards are people who stare at satellite images and strange lines on computer screens. The first thing to understand about this modern search is that it lives in a strange tension. On one side there is cold data, layers of earth, fragments of pottery, radiocarbon dates that place a burned beam in a certain decade of a certain century. On the other side there is a story that has grown for more than 1,000 years, a story full of shining halls and enchanted swords. Every archaeologist who goes out to dig at a site linked to Arthur has to decide how to walk between those two sides without slipping completely into fantasy or into dry numbers. Take Tintagel, for example. People have whispered about that headland in Cornwall for centuries. Geoffrey of Monmouth placed the conception of Arthur there, in a stormy night full of magic and deceit. Later, visitors climbed the steep path, looked down at the sea beating itself against the black rock, and felt that this must be a place where important things happened. For a long time, the stones on the headland were interpreted mainly through the lens of story. This is where the castle of the Cornish king stood. This is where Arthur was born. The ruins we see must belong to that age. Then modern excavations in the late 20th and early 21st centuries dug deeper and recorded more carefully. They showed that the crumbling walls on the summit are not from the time when any real Arthur might have lived. They belong to a later medieval castle, built by powerful lords who probably knew the stories about the hero and wanted to tie their own prestige to his name. Under and around those later walls, however, archaeologists found something more intriguing. They uncovered traces of earlier buildings from the late Roman and early medieval period. These were long, narrow structures, probably made of timber with stone footings. Among the rubble were shards of pottery that had come from distant shores, including the Mediterranean. This meant that someone at Tintagel, during the age when Britain was breaking away from Rome and the Saxons were arriving, had enough wealth and connections to import fine goods from across the sea. The headland was not a ghost story stage. It was a real power center. There was even a broken piece of slate with scratched letters that some read as a fragment of a name, perhaps a local noble or landholder. For a moment, that little object made headlines as a possible hint at a royal presence. Then the excitement cooled. The inscription was too vague to prove anything, and you can find proud local leaders in many places. What remained after the media flurry was still valuable. Tintagel had moved from being only a romantic cliff in the legend to being a documented high-status site of the right period. The same kind of shift has happened in other places. In Shropshire, where the wide fields of the English Midlands roll under big skies, there lies the site of Viroconium, the old Roman city that we now call Wroxeter. In the Roman age, it had streets, baths, and public buildings. When the empire retreated, some of those structures decayed. But the place did not simply vanish. During the last century, archaeologists peeling back layers of soil there found evidence that part of the city center had been reused and remodeled in the 5th century. Among the most discussed finds is a large hall built inside the shell of a Roman courtyard. Its size and plan suggest that someone of considerable importance was trying to make a statement in a world where Roman order had fractured. The hall is not proof of Arthur. It does not have a sign on the door that says Camelot, but it tells us something about the kind of spaces that existed in that age. They were not all tiny hill forts and muddy huts. There were places where a king or warlord could gather counselors, plan campaigns, and hold feasts that might echo the legends we know. When you place discoveries like Wroxeter beside sites like South Cadbury, Glastonbury, and Caerleon, you begin to see a pattern. The landscape of post-Roman Britain was studded with important centers, some on old Roman foundations, some on ancient hilltops. Each could, in theory, be tied to some strand of the Arthurian web. That is both exciting and frustrating. It means there are many plausible settings for a court like Camelot, and almost no way to be completely certain about any one of them. Modern technology has added more layers to this search. In earlier times, to learn what lay under a field, you had to put a spade in the ground. Now researchers have tools that can peer under the surface without turning a single clod of earth. Ground-penetrating radar sends signals into the soil and measures how they bounce back, building a picture of buried walls and ditches. Magnetometers sense tiny changes in the Earth's magnetism caused by ancient fires and filled in pits. Aerial photography and later satellite images pick up crop marks, the faint lines where buried structures affect how plants grow above them. These methods have been used over many suspected Arthurian sites. The results are sometimes dramatic. You can see images where the outline of a forgotten building glows like a ghost under the green of a field. In other cases, the results are more subtle, just hints of straight lines where you would expect only the gentle curves of nature. Each hint beckons to the imagination. A straight line could be a Roman wall, a Christian church, a medieval farmstead, or the remains of a hall where bards once sang of Arthur. On Bodmin Moor in Cornwall stands a mysterious rectangle of enormous stones, surrounded by boggy land and open sky. Locals for years called it King Arthur's Hall. The place feels eerie, especially in low mist. Sheep wander through it. The stones cast long shadows at sunset. For a long time, people assumed it was medieval, perhaps some great court, or an enclosure with special function tied to the legends. Recently, careful study and radiocarbon dating of the surrounding peat have suggested something surprising. The monument is far older than any post-Roman warlord. It belongs to the Neolithic age, thousands of years before anyone spoke the name Arthur. That redating is a good example of how the modern hunt for Camelot often works. A site acquires a legendary name. People tell stories about it for generations. Archaeology arrives with its careful calendars and says, in effect, this is wonderful, but it is not what you thought. The monument is still important. It just belongs to a far more ancient story. King Arthur's Hall does not become less magical because it is Neolithic. If anything, it becomes part of an even larger pattern of human ritual and gathering. Yet its link to a specific medieval king has to be set aside. Glastonbury offers another sort of lesson. The abbey, as we have seen, claimed to have found Arthur's grave and Avalon in its own cemetery. Modern archaeology has dug into the site, tracing the growth of the monastery, the changes in its buildings, and the disasters that struck it. The supposed grave site was disturbed many times. The original cross and bones are long gone. Scholars today tend to see the discovery as an act shaped by economic need and political pressure, rather than as a clear historical revelation. Still, when people visit Glastonbury, many feel something that is hard to describe in purely factual terms. They walk through the broken arches, look up at the sky where a roof once was, and think of monks carving letters into a lead cross to convince the world that Arthur lay there. They climb the green slope of the Tor and look out over the levels that were once wetter, perhaps more island-like, and imagine how Avalon might have been born from that view. The modern hunt for Camelot has to account for these feelings as well as for the data. Science is not entirely comfortable with legends, but legends often point science toward interesting questions. Why did a certain hill attract so many stories? Was there something visible there in the early Middle Ages that impressed visitors? Did it sit at a crossroads of trade routes, or on a defensive spine between valleys? When archaeologists choose where to dig, they read old texts and listen to old tales. They may not believe that every line is true, yet they respect the way memory clings to certain places. There is another thread to this modern story, and that is the way climate and environment studies have changed our understanding of Arthur's supposed age. Ice cores from Greenland, lake sediments from Europe, and tree rings from ancient oaks all tell us that the years around the middle of the 6th century were hard. There is evidence of a volcanic event that darkened skies and cooled temperatures. Chronicles speak of failed harvests and a sun that gave little warmth. If you imagine Britain at that time, already battered by political fragmentation and waves of newcomers, now facing years of strange weather and hunger, the figure of a war leader who managed to hold things together for a while begins to make sense in a new way. He becomes not only a defender against Saxons, but a symbol of stability in a world that felt like it was cracking. Camelot, then, might be not just a beautiful hall, but also a memory of a brief moment when people believed they were safe and united before the dark closed in again. Genetics and the study of old skeletons add yet another view. By examining ancient bones from cemeteries across Britain, scientists can see patterns of ancestry and movement. They find that the arrival of Anglo-Saxon culture was not a simple mass replacement of one people by another, but a more complex mixing of groups, with some areas showing more continental ancestry and others retaining stronger local roots. That picture fits with the idea of coalitions and conflicts that might have needed a figure like Arthur to lead them. There is no gene that spells out his name, of course. Yet the more we learn about the population of that time, the more we understand the stage on which his story would have played out. Beyond the digs and the lab results, there is the constant hum of modern retellings. Every few decades, another film, another television series, another novel takes up Arthur and Camelot and tries to say something new with them. Some put armor and swords on the screen and keep most of the magic. Others strip away the enchantment and show a grim warlord in a muddy Britain, trying to hold on against chaos. Some shift the focus to Guinevere or Morgan or the knights, asking what Camelot looked like from their eyes. These retellings might seem far from serious archaeology, but they shape what the public expects to see when they hear that someone has dug at an Arthurian site. If a film has shown Camelot as a shining city of white stone towers, a visitor to South Cadbury might be surprised to find only grassy banks and the faint traces of timber buildings. If a novel has placed Arthur in a specific region, fans may cling stubbornly to that placement, even when new evidence suggests a broader, more complicated reality. At the same time, modern stories sometimes make use of real discoveries to ground their vision. A writer might read about the Great Hall at Wroxeter and decide to place a crucial council scene there. A filmmaker might study the way archaeologists think the hall at Cadbury was laid out and mirror that in a set. The line between research and imagination runs both ways now. Scholars influence storytellers. Storytellers influence where tourists go and what questions readers ask, which in turn can influence what sites receive funding and attention. So where does that leave the hunt for the true Camelot? If you ask most careful historians today if Arthur was real, many will say that there might have been a historical figure, or even several figures, whose deeds contributed to the legend, but that the single clear King Arthur of the romances almost certainly never existed as described. If you ask them where Camelot stood, they will say that it is most likely a literary creation, that the name first appears in French writing, and that no site has produced evidence that can be tied to it beyond doubt. Yet if you walk the hills of Britain, you will find that the story has done something more subtle than simply reflect a single truth. It has created a map made of belief and curiosity. Cadbury, Caerleon, Tintagel, Glastonbury, Wroxeter, Bodmin Moor, and many other places are now joined not only by roads, but by narrative lines. People visit them as beads on a chain, following Arthur from birth to battles to betrayal to grave, even though those steps were stitched together long after any real events. Each new scientific discovery adds a bead of its own. A hall redated, a fortress traced with radar, a Neolithic monument revealed under an Arthurian name. Sometimes these finds undercut old assumptions. Sometimes they strengthen them. Always they remind us that the land holds far more stories than the ones we already know. In the end, the truth behind the hunt for Camelot may be that we are always looking not only for a lost city, but for a way to connect our own puzzling age to a time when people believed that one good leader and one ring of loyal companions could make sense of the chaos. Modern researchers, with their careful methods, are part of that long desire. They peer into the past through microscopes and computer screens, yet the questions that move them are very close to the ones that moved the poets who first spoke Arthur's name by the fire. Who held the line when everything else was falling? Where did they gather? What did they hope for? Every trench opened, every survey line traced, every sample dated is a quiet way of asking those questions again. The answers are never final. The picture keeps changing as new data arrives. Camelot shifts a little on the map, or blurs at the edges, or splits into several places at once. The legend and the landscape keep talking to each other.